I'm David Baker, and I'm Jewish. Since the Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th, 2 years ago, and Israel's subsequent war in Gaza, I've noticed growing divisions in my community. Around Friday night dinner tables, in the Jewish press, in conversations between friends and colleagues, differences have emerged over Israel's government, over Gaza and the West Bank, over the whole future direction of what the world calls the Jewish state, but what we Jews often just call haaretz, the land. Over the past couple of months, I've been exploring these discussions further. I've been looking at the deep connection that many Jews feel with that tiny country more than 3,000 miles away, and how it's been affected by 2 years of war. The return of the hostages and the announcement of a ceasefire this week has led to a tentative hope for peace. But I'm asking, has the conflict brought British Jews to a real and lasting split over Israel? Israel has always been at the centre of Jewish consciousness, and that's because it was the home of the Jews until they were sent into exile by the Romans in the 1st century. And after that, it became the object of a profound spiritual and political longing felt deeply by Jews wherever they were living in the world.
Israel is the physical, the geographical location of the Jewish people, where the Jewish people settled, we don't know exactly when, at least 1000 BCE.
Jonathan Wittenberg is the senior rabbi of Masorti Judaism in the UK. That's the branch of Judaism that I'm a member of, sitting somewhere between liberalism and orthodoxy. But when I met him in August, I wanted to speak to him in his personal capacity, as someone who's thought long and hard about the deep connection we Jews have with Israel, and who can speak for a broad community of religious Jews for whom spirituality and identity are deeply entwined with their conception of Israel and of the Jewish people.
Israel, in particular Jerusalem, in particular the Temple, feature also as a spiritual centre ever since to which Jews have looked. In all the experiences of marginalisation and persecution, Jews have looked to that as their home. To some, it's been a real aspiration, particularly since the second half of the 19th century, to return physically to the land of Israel. To others, it's been a spiritual centre at the heart of our prayers, at the heart of our aspirations, and it's also, metaphorically, a place where we encounter God in the most close possible way.
That desire to return to the land of Israel became a political movement with the rise of Zionism, which fought for Jewish self-determination. And the form it took when the State of Israel was founded in 1948, was shaped by the socialist principles of the early Zionists.
This is a photograph taken in October 1967. It's when I first went to Israel, and this is me sitting in...
Dame Louise Ellman is showing me a photo from her first trip to Israel, soon after the Six-Day War. I met her in the summer in Manchester, some weeks before the attack on Heaton Park Hebrew Congregation Synagogue. Louise is a former Labour MP, and she was briefly chair of Labour Friends of Israel until she left the Labour Party in 2019 after concerns about the growth of anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn. She's since returned to Labour, and she sees a clear link between her politics and her young fascination with the Jewish state. How important is Israel in your life now?
Israel is very important to me now. At the time I went to Israel for the first time, in 1967, I saw it as an adventure for something I wanted to know about. I don't think I thought of it very much as a refuge at that time. I saw it as an interesting place full of socialist experiments, and I wanted to see how it all worked out. But later on, I started to think a bit differently. And when I came under the hammer for anti-Semitism, which mainly took the form of anti-Zionism in the Labour Party in 2019, and I started to feel very glad that there was a Jewish country that I could go to if I needed to.
No one would be attracted to Israel for its socialist ideals today. But that really was a draw for a young left-wing British Jew back in the 1950s, when Louise was growing up in Manchester. And it says a lot, not only about Israel's political shift, but also about the recent rise of anti-Semitism in the diaspora that she came to see it as a potential place of refuge.
What has been the impact of the events of October the 7th and the subsequent war in Gaza on you? Has it affected your relationship with Israel or the way you think about Israel?
I feel even more supportive of Israel. I feel that once again, I see what Israel is up against, attacked by ruthless enemies who have never made any pretense of their hatred for Israel and their wish to destroy it, and indeed their anti-Semitism. And I'm reinforcing my support for the existence of Israel, and I see all too plainly how people find it very difficult to stand by Israel. It's a very difficult time. That makes me more pro-Israel, not wanting to move away.
Habonim, the socialist youth movement that Louise was part of, was very much a Zionist project, based on a belief in the right of the Jewish people to have their own state. That was in the 1960s, but Zionism is still central for many British Jewish people today. About 2/3 of British Jews describe themselves as Zionist, a figure that's changed little since October the 7th.
In general, I would say, and we've seen this over a long time, that Jews are very emotionally attached to Israel. It's a really important piece of who they are, and it's an important piece of their Jewishness.
Jonathan Boyd is director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, or JPR, an independent think tank that surveys Jewish attitudes in the UK. It draws on a panel of UK residents who self-identify as Jewish, and its data is weighted to include secular Jews and those not part of a Jewish community group. Early this month, it published its latest report. Though it's only one survey, and survey data is by its nature imprecise, it is the most comprehensive snapshot available of British Jewish attitudes to Israel.
Close to 90% of British Jews have been there. So this is a very strong and deep relationship. And broadly speaking, I think what's happened since October the 7th is, whilst I think there's been a lot of movement overall, the picture is a kind of an intensity of attachment. It hasn't necessarily grown dramatically, but I think the intensity of that connection has grown.
Hello?
Hi Claire, it's David Baker from the BBC.
Come on in, through the next 2 doors and up to the 2nd floor.
For Claire, the events of October the 7th triggered a deep intensity of connection with Israel. She's 72, and I went to meet her at her home in southwest England in August. Her father arrived in the UK in 1939 on the Kindertransport, which rescued Jewish children from the Nazi regime. Before October the 7th, she'd had very little relationship with Israel and wasn't part of a Jewish community. But then all that changed. She's asked us not to use her family name.
On October 7th, I had such a visceral reaction to it. I knew something awful had happened and that something wrong had happened, but also the reactions of people within 24 hours who were applauding this atrocity completely shocked me to the core. And since then, I've been hyper alert to anti-Semitism. I even, a couple of months after October 7th, felt the need to be with Jewish people when it wasn't a huge deal for me before. And I looked around and realised I didn't have many Jewish friends. I have some, but not many. And that winter I went to shul several times because I felt the need to be with other Jewish people, and it was very comforting. But I felt it was a bit disingenuous to keep going because I'm not religious. But ever since then, lots of my habits have changed. I'm completely shocked by the image of Israel that has emerged over the last nearly 2 years. I'm really shocked by it. I got very, very angry at seeing a lot of the propaganda. I got very disturbed by some of the views that I was seeing emerging from people that I knew. And I started distancing myself from some people because I couldn't tolerate it. So it started to change a lot of things in my life.
Those changes included cancelling her memberships of the Labour Party and Amnesty International and her subscription to The Guardian because she doesn't agree with their positions on Israel. And she's now planning to go to Israel next year to volunteer.
You say the feeling you had was visceral. Could you tell us a little more about that, what you were seeing and what you were feeling?
It was a full body sensation. Now, I think some of it is generational trauma reawakened. There is some trauma that resides in me, I think, as a result of my father's trauma, which he didn't really address. And so it was handed to me. And I'm the one that seems to have carried that. And so for me, what's happening at the moment in Israel, Gaza war situation, or the Middle East situation, shall we say, it feels so similar to what 1930s Germany must have felt like. And I don't understand people's reactions. And I feel that I am drawn towards Israel to defend it and to be part of it in some small way.
I was really struck by what Claire had to say about how the events of October the 7th, that piercing of a protective border that was supposed to keep Jews in Israel safe from attack, brought up memories of her own family experience in Nazi Germany, a horror that led directly to the founding of the State of Israel in the first place. And that's a trauma that many British Jews will recognise, and a reminder of how deeply that history resonates in the diaspora's relationship with Israel, how it's seen as a safe haven should events turn against Jewish people in Europe. For many Jews, the very idea of even needing somewhere safe to run to is, to put it mildly, pretty uncomfortable. And that importance of Israel as a place of refuge tends to dampen down any criticism of the country we may feel. Why attack the place that may literally end up saving your life? But for a younger generation of British Jews, that bond with Israel is weakening. Jonathan Boyd.
So younger people are noticeably more likely not to identify as Zionists compared to their parents and grandparents, more likely to identify as, particularly as anti-Zionist. What's not clear yet, and what I think we need to do more work on, is exactly what they mean when they're saying they're anti-Zionist. Is it a fundamental rejection of the concept of Jewish statehood in the land of Israel? Or is it just sort of much more about criticism of the current Israeli government and Israeli military policy and those sorts of things?
I would define myself as being anti-Zionist, which is a scary word for a lot of people.
Emily Stevenson is 30. She's always been a political activist, but she didn't start campaigning about Israel until the events of October the 7th, when she joined the Jewish group Na'amod, which advocates for Palestinian rights and seeks, as it puts it, to bring UK Jewish support for the occupation and apartheid to an end. She's now a member of Na'amod's strategic leadership team. When I met her in London last month, she'd just returned from her first visit to Israel, where she spent time in the West Bank with a Jewish organisation that supports Palestinians facing harassment and violence in their communities from settlers and the state.
To me, Zionism in 2025 is an ideology of forced displacement. It's an ideology that says that, the Palestinian inhabitants of what is today modern Israel and the occupied territories either don't exist or need to be removed from the narrative so that Jewish people can return back to a collective homeland. And I think it's a denial to some degree of our position as kind of an ethno group that has this enormous diaspora. So I think for me, that's why I position myself as anti-Zionist. I'm opposed to the actions of the Israeli government, first and foremost, and I think I'm even more opposed to the conditions and the ideology that have allowed everything that we've seen in the 2 years come to pass.
And are you opposed to even the very founding of the state in 1948, when there was a big displacement of Palestinians?
I think that's a really hard question to answer. I think genuinely that's a very hard question because it's so emotive. I think, we can't deal in counterfactuals. If the State of Israel was founded as a binational democratic state with equal rights for Jewish refugees and for Palestinians, then that would have been great. But the fact of the matter is it wasn't. And as someone who calls themselves an anti-racist, I have to be opposed to any ethno-state and the founding of any ethno-state.
In the past 2 years, Na'amod's membership has grown from 250 to 900. Still a small number, considering that there are 300,000 Jews living in Britain, but a significant increase nonetheless. Israel's conduct in the war in Gaza didn't just have an impact on the younger generation. In April this year, 36 members of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, a cross-communal body that represents the majority of British Jews, wrote to the Financial Times protesting against the extremism of the Israeli government, its actions in Gaza and the West Bank, and its failure to free the hostages. Harriet Goldenberg, a psychotherapist based in London, instigated and helped draft the letter.
The final prompt was when Israel broke the ceasefire at the beginning of April. So we were just despondent, really, very upset, concerned, and felt it was really important that there was a Jewish voice commenting on what was going on. At that time, I was vice chair of the International Division. My platform when I took on that role was that as diaspora Jews, we are partners with Israel. And that therefore it's important that we claim that role and make our views known. And I was not having success at getting the board to make a statement. Therefore, we felt that maybe a few of us could do so.
The letter was not received well by the Board of Deputies. It suspended Harriet and 4 other members and warned the other signatories that any future breach of its rules could result in their suspension too. The board stated at the time that the letter did not reflect its views and called for unity, not division. It has claimed that the letter was published in its name, misrepresenting the board, which Harriet denied when we met last month.
There is this mission of the idea of unity, particularly in relation to Israel. And that gets a bit complex. So there is a concern felt by others that I don't share, that we feed into anti-Semitism if we speak out against Israel. First of all, I don't think anybody who took part in the letter was speaking out against Israel. They were speaking out against the current Israeli government's actions. That's quite a different thing. But I also think that actually, rather than feeding into anti-Semitism, there is something about acknowledging when something wrong is happening that adds to your credibility or actually maintains your credibility. And I think silence is complicity. I said that at the time. And the Jewish community knows that more than any other community in the world, probably.
What kind of reactions did you get?
I mean, I certainly had strong support from my synagogue, from an awful lot of people that I didn't know. Yeah, I mean, people were glad we had written it.
What does that tell you about the British community's relationship with Israel? Is that changing, do you think?
I think part of the fallout of the Israeli government's actions is that the Jewish world is suffering, not just because of a rise of anti-Semitism, but that there are huge divisions here in the British Jewish community and elsewhere, certainly in North America, but that there is a strong presence of Jews who feel this is not representing us.
And then, in July, a few months after the letter Harriet instigated was published in the Financial Times, it looked as if the Board of Deputies had changed its position. In a statement, it criticised the use of food as a weapon of war in Gaza and called for a massive and sustained flow of aid. Phil Rosenberg is president of the Board of Deputies. I met him in September.
I think there's been a change of tonality, but the week that letter came out, I was on BBC Radio 4 saying those positions. We want to see the hostages out, we want to see aid in, we want to see Hamas gone, and we want to see lasting peace and security for Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider Middle East.
I'm sorry to push you on this, but it seems to me it hasn't been consistent. The tonality is not what's changed. Now it's a much more critical line of Israel. I mean, what's changed inside the organisation?
Not much has changed within. I mean, I would say that the situation on the ground appears in a different way, perhaps in May and July than it perhaps did in April. And that has changed the tonality with which we've explored the issues that we are.
Whatever the board's position, that letter itself was something of a watershed for British Jews. Almost for the first time, it felt that we could be public about disagreements that up to that point we were having privately. And it encouraged others to speak out too. Since then, there's been a kind of domino effect of letters and statements on the subject, and that seems to have led to deeper and more nuanced conversations about Israel and a greater openness to debate.
I think that there's a range of views. I think that there's a significant number of people in our community who take the view that even if they may disagree with some of the things that Israel does, mainstream organizations like mine should not say anything publicly critical. That's not to say we shouldn't say things privately that are critical, but there's enough hostility to Israel out there that really it's not our job to say things that are critical in the public space, even if privately we might have some criticisms. There's another group of people who say no. Even as Zionists, even as people who support the Israel project and really want Israel to succeed, if we don't like what its government is doing, and particularly if we're really profoundly disagreeing, we should really be saying that publicly and using whatever we can, the voice that we can, to make it known what our views are. And there's a third group of people, I would say, who really just want the shouting to stop. And that's really the kind of different forms of expression. I must say that on some level, whilst that is challenging, and, they say there are 2 Jews and 3 opinions, I have 300 deputies and a community of 300,000. So you can imagine how many opinions that is. But actually, there's something quite healthy about that, engaging in different ways with the very complex situation that's before us.
One debate that's being heard more often among British Jews is whether or not the actions of Israel's current government live up to what we might call core Jewish values. I asked Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg for his thoughts on this when we met in August.
For almost 2 millennia, Jews did not have political power and were at the mercy of others, which was very often a terrible destiny. During that time, through profound faithfulness to the Torah and its commentaries, Judaism evolved a religion based on the creation of community, the observance of the commandments, the love of life, and core values, particularly the practice of justice, the study of Torah, the practice of compassion, and the dignity of all human beings. And they've been the foundation of Judaism for millennia. When in Israel there's again political power, those values are on the line. And innumerable Jews living in Israel, leaders, politicians, rabbis have understood this and fought hard for those values. But there's also been a Judaism which we've seen, we see it now, about driving out others, about the land being ours, in ways which I find an affront to the Judaism I believe in.
That concern has also shown up in the Institute for Jewish Policy Research's survey. Around 50% of respondents said that the way Israel has conducted the war in Gaza clashes with their Jewish values. So if we feel Israel's actions don't live up to what we see as Jewish values, what's then our role as Jews in the diaspora? Do we have a responsibility to speak out?
Israel is a creation of the diaspora. It is the very embodiment of diaspora ideals, Jewish ideals. And therefore, our right to contribute and our obligation to contribute is as equal as our obligation to defend.
Sir Mick Davis is former chief executive of the Conservative Party. I spoke to him last month. He's the co-founder of a new pressure group called the London Initiative, which is aiming to change Israel's political direction. The initiative includes Israelis and Palestinians, diaspora Jews and non-Jews. Its stated aims include strengthening Israeli democracy and seeing the country fulfill the vision of the founding principles of its Declaration of Independence in 1948.
That Declaration of Independence had these 3 fundamental propositions, the 3 pillars upon which society in Israel was going to grow and prosper. That it would be a liberal democracy. It would be manifestly fair for all its citizens, not just fair in law, but fair in practice, and that it would be living in peace with its neighbors, and its most immediate neighbors are the Palestinians. And I find today that's not being followed, and I think we are heading towards an illiberal democracy. Divisions within Israeli society are manifest and growing, and there is no fairness across different groups within Israel. And we don't live in peace. We've lived for the last 40 years thinking we can contain a conflict or manage a conflict, but we never resolved the conflict. And so the London Initiative was born out of the fact that these fundamental core value propositions, they need to be reintroduced into the social and political debate of Jewish and Israeli society, because the Overton window has moved so far to the right that anybody who gets up and speaks about peace and fairness and liberal democracy, they're considered to be stupid, naive, or whatever. And you're going to move it back into the center, that there are legitimate and important parts of the discourse, because that will then frame the political direction, strategic direction of Israel politics. And the fourth underlying principle, that there is a partnership between diaspora Jews and Israelis for this to take place, that there is no separation.
I wanted to find out in this programme if a split was emerging among British Jews over Israel. There are certainly signs that younger people are moving away from their parents' and grandparents' traditional ties with the country, though it remains to be seen whether that's something that will last. And as we've heard, there are also older Jews who describe themselves as Zionist but do not necessarily support Israel's actions unconditionally. Though for others, the events of October the 7th have only strengthened their ties with the country. But what I've learnt from these conversations over the past couple of months is how profound British Jewish thinking is over Israel. The news of a ceasefire and of hostages returning home is rightly being celebrated by British Jews on all sides of the debate. But the people I met with were keen to speak about much deeper issues than the daily news. About values, responsibility, and identity. Something that was brought home horribly when Heaton Park Synagogue in Manchester was attacked at the beginning of this month, and we were reminded of the very real threats to our existence. What's clear when it comes to Israel is that the last 2 years have been a turning point. When the news of Hamas's attack on October the 7th was raw, we would have been hesitant to have conversations like these in private, let alone in public. But now disagreements about the country and our relationship with it are being openly expressed and debated. And for me, that's good news. I'm hopeful that we can find a way of living with our differences.
Hello there, I'm John Kay, and I just wanted to tell you there's an update in my true crime investigation, Fairy Meadow, which tells the story of a little girl called Cheryl Grimmer. She vanished from Fairy Meadow Beach in Australia more than 50 years ago. Our podcast from BBC Radio 4 has had hundreds of emails from listeners, including potential witnesses who think they might have important information. So in our new episode, I hear their stories and find out what response they've had from police. And we catch up with Cheryl's family as they step up their campaign for justice. Subscribe to Fairy Meadow on BBC Sound.